Welcome to the final debate of Polityka Insight and Geremka Center conference. American comedian John Oliver had once hosted a TV program where he invited just the best human beings available. He entitled it People Who Think Good. I would like to steal that title and invite our audience to the discussion of three brilliant minds who not only think good, but who will also make us think good. We are pleased to welcome Mrs. Heather Grabbe. Heather is a director of Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels. I recommend her TEDx talks about the need for critical thinking and her publications about the democracy in Europe. Next is Mr. Ivan Krastev, chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies and author. He's about to publish a very interesting essay about the post-pandemic Europe in Krytyka Polityczna in July. And we are also having with us Polish philosopher and essayist, I would call him a public intellectual, Mr. Tomasz Stawiszyński from Radio Tok FM. He started recently a very successful podcast called The Otherwise. It's really worth listening. Welcome. As an introduction, I would like to quote an observation from Barbara Tuchman's book, The Distant Mirror, in which she wrote about Black Death plague in 14th century. History of that century is full of deaths, horrors, wars, rebellions. And yet, Barbara Tuchman noticed that there was virtually no description of the plague itself. No author wrote of what actually happened during the plague to the people and how this horrific experience transformed the people and the society. Boccaccio, Petrarca never mentioned the plague. But we know that after this century of horrors, the revolution of Renaissance erupted. The known world was almost completely transformed into something different because of this pandemic. Today, we observe quite similar phenomena. We only talk about how COVID-19 transforms China into something bigger, how to restart economy, or whether COVID-19 will be a reason for collapse of Donald Trump administration. But there is little attention to what the plague actually means for the people, how the current plague transforms societies and civilization. You remember in the beginning of March, April, there was almost instant prophecies from many experts, many scholars who predicted, I quote, end of liberalism, end of globalization, rise of China, economic collapse on the scale of Great Depression. Sometimes between May and June, these predictions almost all of a sudden stopped. What happened? Why we were so scared? Will this pandemic consequences at all? Can we sense any major global change looming on the horizon? Or is this pandemic just merely an event in the history rather than trend? With this general question, I would like to start our panel and give voice first to Mr. Stawiszyński.
Thank you very much. First, I want to say that this is a great pleasure and great honor to be here in such brilliant company. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much. Well, I think that in the recent months, we've been dealing with very specific dynamics, and the history of coronavirus expansion in the West began with fantasy, then fantasy became a reality for a moment, and then it became fantasy again, and now we are living in the fantasy. In December and January, let's start with some chronology, we received information about some mysterious new disease, about the outbreak which was detected in China. But apart from a strict circle of specialists in this field, epidemiology, probably no one took this threat seriously. At most, it was news sounding for most of us as real as, I don't know, Stephen King's novel The Stand, a book that was soon to be considered, contrary to the author's intentions, truthfully saying, as prophetic. Well, it was those news. It was as real as a lot of movies about pandemics and other disasters that we watched with bated breath in cinemas or in the or on the screens of computers or our TV sets, and after the final subtitles we were breathing with a sigh of relief, because these kind of things like pandemics and such catastrophes happens only there in the fiction, never in the world around us. We thought so, I think. And then at the turn of February and March, reality accelerated rapidly and invaded our homes and our minds. Images flowing through the media from Italy or Spain have become increasingly drastic. Hundreds, thousands of people we have seen under the ventilators, hundreds, thousands dead, taken away by military trucks. And it was disturbing and terrifying. And so we were frightened then. We stopped for a moment. And then we realized that something real is starting to happen there. And then the restrictions were introduced, first in Italy and Spain, France, then in other European countries. So we were locked in homes, cut off from contacts with loved ones, with close ones. We were terrified of the prospect of health loss or death, ourselves or our loved ones. And we painfully experienced, we may say, the decomposition of several myths which were very strongly established in the Western collective consciousness, or maybe we should say collective unconsciousness. And I think that, first of all, the myth of the individual responsibility for one's fate was decomposed or deconstructed by that experience. That myth that I am the captain of my success and of my loss, that I am wholly and fully responsible for what's going on in my life and the place which I have in the social structure, in the economic structure also. So it was the first myth, I think, that was busted by this experience. And then the myth of immortality, which one may achieve with a proper diet and exercise, that we will live forever and we will be healthy when we will do certain exercises, or we will be devoted to the certain diet. But above all, I think what was in that experience in March, in April, in May also, I think that above all, the myth that we live in a relatively stable and rational reality, whose structure is prepared for various eventualities and crises. That myth was deconstructed above all, I think, because it turned out that it's exactly the opposite. It turned out that when one small disturbing factor appears, invisible virus, very, very small, the whole structure immediately falls out of the frame. And I think that this was pretty intense experience for a lot of us.
So for you,
then what the
so for you it was about the control of the reality.
I think that it was a very important part of that experience, that we don't have control. Not only we personally don't have control over our lives, but also the institutions who say that have the control doesn't have it exactly. But I think that we saw also something more even scary and more terrible. I think that we saw that this system we are living in is not designed for the old and the sick. I think that the virus showed it ruthlessly. We saw the dilemmas, the problems.
Thank you, Tomasz. And what was this period for Mrs. Heder, Mrs. Grabbe?
Thank you very much. Dziękuję bardzo. It's a pleasure to be with you today. So this period also made me think about history, like you, and think about the myths that we tell ourselves, that interdependence is always positive, that globalization brings wealth to everybody. There were plenty of myths that were busted, as Tomasz has just been pointing out. And I think what's really interesting in thinking about the historical parallel that you gave us at the very beginning, Piotr, is about the Black Death, is how much we tend to overestimate the change in the short run and underestimate the long-term change that it will have. Because the Black Death, it killed a lot of people, but the societal changes followed for centuries thereafter, because of the way that it upended, it completely turned on their head many of the structures of power and wealth in societies at the time. It's because of the Black Death, for example, that it was possible to have the peasants' revolt later, because there was a shortage of labor. So the peasants were able to sell their labor, to revolt and demand a higher price for their labor, because there were fewer people. But similarly, it allowed the Renaissance because you had the fixed systems of power and control through the church, through the feudal system, and so on, had all been changed as a result of the pandemic. And I think what would be interesting now is to consider which power structures have really been shaken and which ones remain still quite intact. And that's important because so much of the effects of this crisis on politics are the result of the intensification of trends that were already present. So one of those trends was a loss of trust in government institutions and in the capacity of governments. That's been going on for some time after the kind of post-1989 consensus has started to crumble. And so in the short term, you saw the effects of people having more trust in governments, being willing to submit themselves to, for example, restrictions on their civil liberties during lockdown, and being willing to put up with privations and also to show more solidarity in their community. So a lot of really positive stories of, great behavior by citizens and even by some politicians and companies during this period. But how long does it last for? Is it just something for a few weeks? And how quickly do the familiar structures of capitalism and of the familiar political structures just reassert themselves? We are seeing that happening. And that's quite important because of the way that citizens clearly expect the state to respond to this pandemic. And incumbent governments everywhere have done very well in terms of increasing their popularity because people turn to a source of authority and somebody who can take charge in an emergency like this. But quite soon, people start to see when things haven't gone very well, and that's when the opposition and definitely when populists can start to kind of pick away at that trust, the renewed trust again. So that, I think, will happen quite fast over the coming years, and that will, so we have a short-term effect of more trust in government, but it won't last, and some of the figures that have been cited today show that. But there's also the question of how people's perceptions of interdependence have changed, because a lot of what this pandemic has shown is the dark side of interdependence and of globalization. The fact that these extremely long supply chains that stretch around the planet, they might deliver cheap goods, but they can easily be disrupted. Look at how difficult it is to get masks. Surgical masks are not an expensive or high-tech item, but there was a huge crisis of producing more of them. And it's also showed the dark side of globalization in terms of the inequalities that it has created. It has created massive differences in the resilience of individual societies and also of people within those societies. Those who can cope with a few months of lost income, those businesses and those people who can cope with that, and those who can't. Those who can find new opportunities in an economy that can start getting going again, and those who can't. And again, much more of a demand for the state to step in here. But what's interesting about this is that that although people are asking for big government to a larger extent than before in Europe, we see that across Europe, and to an extent in other countries too, but especially in Europe, it's very strong. We want, Mutti, as they say in Germany, or, the state to come back in and to protect us from these things and to have equipment available and be able to cope with pandemics and so on. That doesn't necessarily mean big governance. in the sense of international cooperation and international institutions. The calls for strengthening the WHO, the World Health Organization, have not gone that far. So where does this really end in terms of the role of the state and the relationship between state and citizen? That's still very unclear. Citizens want the state to be able to respond, but are they really willing to give the state the means to do that? And especially if there's an economic depression and if there's a debt crisis, which is not clear yet whether that will happen, will states actually be able to deliver on citizens' expectations? And the final point I'd make on that is that states have lots of flaws. They don't work terribly well often, but they are in the end the best way of organizing things that we've managed to find over the centuries. You know, to paraphrase Churchill, democracy is the worst form of government, apart from all the others that we've tried. And organizing things through the state has proved to be better in this pandemic than trying to organize it through markets, as Tomasz pointed out. And yet still we have a problem, because this pandemic is a small wave in comparison with the tsunami that is going to hit us over the next 2 decades because of climate change. We're going to have lots more massive crises, rising sea levels, insect-borne diseases, all kinds of problems that are much more disruptive even in this pandemic. If you look at what the insurance industry is predicting as likely scenarios that they need to insure against, it's really terrifying. So if our states don't really have the wherewithal to cope with this, then how are we going to cope with the future? It's important to look at that issue right now.
You are absolutely right when it comes to the role of the state during the crisis, and it really doesn't looks like it doesn't matter what kind of state is coping with the crisis, whether be it authoritarian or democratic. Mr. Krastev, what's your initial thoughts about this first period of pandemic?
Listen, historically, because of course when you're exiled in your own apartment, what you start to read is history, we know that our minds are organized in the way and designed in the way that we remember wars and revolutions, but we don't know how to remember pandemics. And nevertheless, the pandemics, what was said before by Hedda, was very much transformative for the way of our life. We don't remember it. Laura Spinney is giving beautiful statistics. Probably 2 or 3 times more people have died as a result of the Spanish flu than compared to the World War I or even more than World War II. But if you're going to ask people what is the worst thing that happened in the 20th century, they're not going to be a single person who is going to say the Spanish flu. There are 80,000 books globally written about the World War I, and there are 400 about the Spanish flu. And one of the stories that in a flu, that this is arbitrary. When you're dying in a war, there is a narrative. Basically, you're sacrificing your life for something. When basically you're dying in a flu, the only thing that remains from the chronicles is what the plagues are remembered for is deaths without funerals. And we saw this even in Italy and Spain during this crisis. You have Zoom funerals because people are afraid to go on the funeral because they're afraid of basically being infected. So I do believe, and I'm going to basically end on this, on the level of political imagination, this crisis in a certain way moved people into different directions. On one level, it radicalized the imagination of some people. For example, if you're a climate activist, and you have been dreaming all your life that all planes are going to be landed, but you never believed that this is possible, and suddenly it happened. Or if you're a radical nationalist and you have been dreaming of resurrecting the borders between the EU member states, and overnight it happened. So for this type of people, suddenly certain things that till yesterday have been impossible started to look possible. For a big majority of others, in a certain way, the result of the crisis is that even people who try to believe that pre-COVID-19 world was abnormal, now it starts to look as a normality lost. So dreaming go back to this normality is something that in a certain way is driving many people and try to see this kind of a COVID-19 episode as a collective hallucination. And this is particularly strong in the places and countries in which there were not many dead people, that basically people can say themselves, what was this all about at the end?
Thank you very much. And indeed, experts should really take into consideration not to jump into conclusion too fast or too quickly. because as you just said, the outcome could be much bigger and much longer, and we should look at it from the broader, more distant perspective. One of the major aspects of the current international politics is disinformation and the way superpowers exploited the pandemics to follow and to promote their international agendas. But it seems like only working in a short span or on a very instant scale. China on April was called a benevolent empire, and recent publication of John Bolton's book, where he talks about the concentration camps, are kind of undermining this image. Even when Donald Trump seems to be unfit to deal with this crisis, people are in every capital of the world. People are protesting, demonstrating because of the tensions, because of the tensions between Afro-American communities and U.S. police, and it shows that United States, America, has still this appeal, world appeal. I mean, the general appeal of the very important country when it comes to culture, civilization, etc. So China is still China, and America is something still promised land, so to say. Disinformation seems to be working only on a short perspective, and as you mentioned before, the longer perspective is really frightening. The climate change, the outcome of this pandemic in a broader sense. I would like to hear your views on how the international politics cope with the questions of truth and falsehoods, especially how global institutions like European Union, United Nations, NATO can survive pandemic disinformation and post-pandemic turmoil. And we will start with Heather, the first answer, please.
Well, thank you. It's a really difficult question, actually, because these are all institutions that were set up after the Cold War at a moment when there was a strong consensus among elites about what needed to be done and what were the new values after the Second World War on which Europe should be built. And also the United Nations, of course, came into being at that point in time. And these days we're in a very different period where elites no longer agree with one another. There are plenty of anti-establishment parties that come to power and which overturn some of the assumptions that political elites used to have about what is truth and falsehood, and where it's harder and harder in the information age for people to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And remember that, Hannah Arendt warned us that the real problem for democracy and for any system of governance is not the diehard communist or the convinced fascist. The most loyal citizen of those regimes is the one for whom the difference between truth and falsehood is no longer apparent. So she wrote that, of course, during the dark time of the Second World War, but her writings on authoritarianism are still incredibly relevant now, because she points out how much it's about what's in our heads and our ability to distinguish, to understand what's going on around us, to make sense of what's happening to us, that is critical to our ability as citizens to cope with life and to play a role in society, and it's critical for a democratic system to survive. And those things are being eroded really rapidly. It's striking how, for example, during the pandemic, many of the anti-vaccine groups on, for example, social media, instead of taking a knock, which you'd expect when much of the world is waiting now for a vaccine to save us from the pandemic, in fact, they've been increasing their support by arguing that it's all part of a great conspiracy. And conspiracy theory, as many studies have shown, is the ultimate form of disinformation, because just the idea that there is a conspiracy out there, whether you believe a particular conspiracy theory or one or another, just the idea that there is a conspiracy of people who are controlling this and who are in charge of this is itself incredibly damaging to citizens to take matters into their own hands and form their own opinions. It makes them passive. It makes them unwilling to engage. And that's vital, not only to how they vote and whether democracy can be upheld, but also to how they react, how resilient they are in a pandemic, whether, for example, they take seriously the advice of public health authorities and protect their own health and that of their families and their neighbors by observing the public health edicts. So this is a really critical thing, and I won't go into the disinformation statistics because we've had lots of presentations on that during this event today, but just to note a couple of things which are, I think, really vital to trying to handle disinformation, because it's now a fact of life. It's there. It's not going to go, this is not a genie that can go back in the bottle. So how do we cope with that? And by we, I don't just mean political elites. I mean we as citizens. How do we keep ourselves resilient during what are going to be very turbulent times ahead? I think one thing is that people actually have to take responsibility for it themselves. It's true, as previous speakers today have said, that media literacy classes and education for children are vital, digital literacy also for the older generation. That's vital, but that also depends on the demand side. It's not just the supply side of the education system or the government, but that citizens, civil society organization and civil society action to encourage digital literacy and encourage people to question what they hear and to look for diverse sources of information and what are the sources of what they're reading on the web. This is really vital, and this has got to be at community level, because it's in communities and families that people have trusted links which are going to make them disbelieve what they may be hearing through other social media. So I think support for civil society organizations that are able to work at grassroots level on critical thinking. That sounds very abstruse, but it's critical thinking. Being able to think for yourself and judge a good source of information from a bad source of information is really vital. The other thing is, frankly, government regulation of the platforms. What this pandemic has shown is they can take very rapid action when they're suitably incentivized. So after all these years of saying, no, we can't really do content regulation, it's so difficult, and then saying at the beginning of the pandemic, we don't have enough people to do content regulation, we don't have enough cleaners to go through all this online material. They then speeded up their use of artificial intelligence to do so, which has its pros and cons, but they very much speeded it up. And they changed their policies. WhatsApp changed its policies, and it became much less important as a vector of disinformation. Facebook started taking action on bots and fake Facebook accounts, which were using it for disinformation. So I think that the pandemic has brought some important lessons about the kind of regulation that could bring more rapid change, and which could treat the platforms as the essentially public goods providers that they really are. So I think there's a role for the government, but there's also a role for civil society and for each of us to maintain our critical faculties. And from that point of view, I think that's perhaps a marriage between the more kind of socialist point of view that, it's the state that should provide these things, and the more libertarian point of view that the individual is responsible. Actually, both are responsible, because it's not going to be an international agency that solves this problem. It's going to be individuals and at every level.
Thank you, Heather, for especially for mentioning conspiracy theories. I will ask Mr. Stawiszyński about it a little bit later. But Mr. Krastev first. You wrote this essay about the post-pandemic Europe, which will be published quite soon here, also in Poland. How would you describe Europe, especially European Union, after this pandemic? I mean, what is your description of the status of the institutions, but from the perspective of disinformation, of this propaganda war that's going on, and has this pandemics as a base?
Listen, part of it, of course, is propaganda, but part of them is that some major disaster comes. And people are trying to look for explanations. If you go back to history, you're going to see that not only this pandemic, any epidemics created a huge variety of conspiracy theories, because this is a major disaster and we don't know who is the villain. People cannot live in a complex world where they're told that something is accidental. So they're trying to find the explanations. And also don't forget, we had a lot of free time. We have been staying in our apartments. We have time to read all these stories. So I'm not particularly surprised that you have this boom of conspiracy theories. It's quite interesting to see how they varied the favorite conspiracy theories from country to country. But one of the major things that happened when the pandemic started was the expectations. And I was also sharing this idea back then that because of the nature of this crisis, we're going to see the return of the trust in experts and expertise. Because we have been witnessing that during this crisis, there was always the medical doctor next to the prime minister or the minister. And in a certain way, people have been religiously following all the briefings of these medical experts. The interesting story is, and today, basically, we published a paper which is based on a survey in 9 EU member states, including Poland. European Council on Foreign Relations published it, and it shows that, in fact, contrary to these expectations, the result of the pandemic is not the increased trust in expertise and knowledge. Basically, you end up with 3 groups of people now when the first stage of pandemics is over. There are those who never believed that science matters and the science could be trusted, and part of their mistrust is rooted in the fact that science is based on disagreement, on doubts. Medical experts disagree between themselves, but for many people, the very fact that there is not one opinion is a good enough idea to say you cannot trust experts. There is a second group who basically believe that experts should be trusted and trust them, but there is also a third quite big group, 1/3 of the Europeans tested, who said probably experts know what is going on and they're better prepared than others, but at the end of the day, this is not that experts inform politicians, but much more politicians use experts to justify already taken decisions. So unlike basically experts helping politicians to get more trust as a result of this crisis, we see how the general mistrust in government is also backfiring against the experts. And from this point of view, something is critically interesting, and Heather touched on it. Listen, now if you listen to all our conversations, and we don't know when the crisis is going to be over, we don't know if it's going to be a second wave or not, and people are saying only when the vaccine is going to arrive, we can be sure that we can contain these pandemics. But at the same time, half of the Americans only have declared that they're going to use vaccine if it's available. And even in many European countries, up to 1/3 and more of the public is like this. So it is not simply that when we talk about disinformation, that this is governments, be it Chinese or Russian or any other governments, trying basically to go and manipulate people. I do believe we are living in a situation of a much more profound mistrust. And part of it is also based on the complexity of the world in which people are living. The personal experience does not play the role which it used to play before. And as a result of it, basically, people are much more seeing every crisis as a confirmation of their biases and what they have been trusting anymore. And what people are trusting most is that nobody should be trusted.
Well, Ivan, thank you very much, especially the fate of poor Dr. Fauci in United States is quite an example for what you have said about experts and how they are being used by politicians to strengthen their agenda. This is absolutely right. Although there was a time when almost everybody thought that this is the time of expertise, that the experts or scholars or scientists are back behind the wheel. Well, the division you quoted, these three groups of opinions, is something to the contrary of this new belief. When it comes to beliefs and conspiracies, Tomasz is also an expert here in Poland in his podcast and his speeches. There was this interesting point you made in some other place, that conspiracies can become a religion, and that might be a kind of a interesting aspect of the conspiracy theories, which are the forms of the disinformation, obviously. Could you say something about this? I think it could be a very interesting point.
Well, on the basic level, they have a similar role as religion. I will say about it in a few moments. But first of all, I'd like to say in the context of our conversation here and what was said before, in the context of pandemic, that actually the pandemic crisis we are still in right now is the first such major crisis in the era of social media expansion. I mean, the last decade has been a time of giant technological leap and acceleration in that area, and the coronavirus crisis is the first big one during these years on such scale. But it is also a time of expansion of various conspiracy theories on unprecedented scale, and I think that we often underestimate the power of conspiracy thinking in modern world. We are used to see conspiracy thinking just as a form of misconception, but we underestimate the scale of that thing. And now conspiracy theories and a lot of public policy polls show that became something of a universally worldview, universally binding worldview. And in the virtual world we are living in, and we were living in during the pandemic, the credibility of a message or a thesis or something which is said depends on how attractive it is and how effectively it affects our emotions, not on whether it is reliable and proven. And of course, conspiracy theories, I think that this is important for us to consider this point, is not, or perhaps even not primarily, misconception. Conspiracy theories are also, or perhaps above all, narratives that help people discern the world. In that sense, they are similar to religion. They help to understand their own and other people's experiences, explain their own position, their own fate, or the position in the social hierarchy. So the education, I think, that teaches the rules of rational thinking, verification, and the difference between knowledge and ignorance is just one of the possible countermeasures here. Because the lack of trust in institutions and elites seems to be much more primary and important than education gaps, I think. Because this is a lack of trust that conspiracy narratives personifies in that mythological and symbolic way, from secret laboratories in Wuhan to the reptilian conspiracy. I think that people just generally don't believe today that politicians representing liberal Western elites actually want good for them, that those politicians are interested in people's well-being. I think that on the contrary, they have the impression that this group is actually turning against them and even poses a threat to them. So populists and conspiracy theorists smoothly enters this space, this empty gap after trust. So what can you do then? I think that the answer is simple but extremely difficult to practice. Rebuild trust, rebuild institutions, try to show that the idea of community is really about the community of everyone and not about the benefits of a small privileged group. What can we do else? First of all, I think that, and this is very important point also, I think, the philosophical one, let's say. I think that liberal and leftist circles should decide which side they are on, whether on the side of the concepts or philosophical ideas which claims that every narrative is equivalent, or that each narrative is an expression of some political positions. It means that less important is what is being said than who is speaking. Or on the other side, are we on the side of, let's say, epistemological realism, which uses the concepts of truth and falsehood and distinguishes between true and untrue sentences, justified and unjustified points of view, and points that their genesis of what is said, genealogy of what is said, has nothing to do with the logical value of what is said. It cannot be denied, in my opinion, that the original sin of post-truth times, one of the many original sins of post-truth times, are the philosophical concepts which were mostly developed in the second half of the 20th century, and were then intensively applied to political discourses, according to which truth is an ominous and is something which leads to violence, and is especially and primarily the tool of power, not the tool of knowledge, or rather the tool of knowledge as much as the tool of power. However, I think that in recent years, it turned out that where the truth disappears, the violence comes. So the winner is not the story behind the facts and not something which is proven or reliable, but the story which has a stronger team behind. So I think that without rebuilding trust, but without also philosophical and political rehabilitation of the concept of truth, we may read more Hannah Arendt than postmodernists, for example, we will not get out of the current crisis.
You mentioned violence, and when it comes to violence, there is no better place, violence and religion, there is no better place to go back like Middle Ages again. Let me just, we have still 14 minutes, so let me very quickly jump back to Middle Ages and the roots of European culture, the apocalypse of St. John and its vision of 4 riders, 4 horses, pestilence, famine, war, death. We witnessed the pestilence in the form of the COVID-19 plague. Famine rides freely through Africa and Middle East, where we have more than 70 million refugees. What about war? This is I think, the most important question of all ages, but also, as Tomasz mentioned, after the truth collapses, the violence begins. Is there a possibility of war in a modern world? But I'm not mentioning these small, long wars that are ravaging places around the world, but I'm talking about this proper war, if you allow me. So, question of war. I would like to start with Mr. Krastev.
Thank you. Listen, it's quite important to understand what is a proper war. Is it a nuclear? Is it the end of the world? Deutsche Bank recently came with their risk scenarios, and they basically claim that the possibility of a kind of a major military clash in the next 20 years is about 30%. Yes, you can do it for sure. But this is also part of the story that we see. If you compare COVID-19 till now and see how many people have died, this is incomparable with the Spanish flu. This is, of course, incomparable with the Black Death. So what is really striking us is not what has really happened, but what could have happened. We're living in the world of projections. And this is normal because of the interdependency of the world, because of the complexity of the world. So we're in a situation exactly because everything becomes so destructive that we are doomed to overreact. There is a problem with, for example, with a single concrete Japanese nuclear power stations, and Germany decided basically to close its nuclear industry, for good or bad. But I'm saying that we're living in the world in which when something hinted to this type of a crisis, everybody starts to behave as if we're going to live with the worst case scenario. But does it mean that the war is possible? Yes, it means. As a result of this crisis, we see the world which is going to be much more polarized. This crisis intensified certain trends that had been there before. One of them is a kind of increased rivalry between the United States and China, and I don't believe that regardless of what is going to be the result of the American elections, this kind of a conflict is going to be overcome. We saw the world in which, nevertheless, that we can expect it. The pandemic is type of crisis in which you can expect much more international cooperation. You can expect much more effective response from multilateral institutions. This did not happen. So yes, we can expect a war. And honestly speaking, this is not simply a small wars. You have wars here and there. India and China have been kind of fighting with not many dead, but on the border, something in a region where they have not been doing since 1962. So we basically can come to the idea that the general tensions and the general equilibrium have been very much broken. And talking about the different horsemen, I'm not so strong on the biblical text, but there is a children's book which was talking about some Lord Ronald who jumped on his horse and start riding off in all directions at the same time. One of the interesting effects for me of this crisis is that unlike other transformative moments, like for example 1989, where at least you have the illusion that you know where the world is going, now we don't know. And we have the feeling that really different parts of the world, different parts of societies are riding in different directions.
Thank you, Ivan. Tomasz, you mentioned violence, so maybe you have more pessimistic closing remarks than Ivan, who seemed who presented rather optimist scenarios, relatively optimist. Tomasz, please.
Children's books are always more optimistic than the apocalyptic literature.
Okay, so let me say very shortly that I always have in mind when I think about the war or hear about the war, a book which I think is one of the most profound insights into this theme. This is the book by James Hillman, American psychologist and philosopher, which is titled A Terrible Love of War. So Hillman writes in this book, on the contrary to many analyses by political philosophers or sociologists or psychologists, even social psychologists especially, and politologists also, on the contrary, that war is not just a matter of politics, it's not just an extension of politics pursued by other means, other tools, but this is also or primarily a case of imagination and a passion. And that's why this is unpredictable matter, the effect of something that gets out of control and which has a lot of to do with the myths, the imagination, the fantasies. I remember also a book by Nicholas Goodrick Clarke, a historian of religion from Oxford, which is called The Occult Roots of Nazism. And he writes also that we underestimate some sort of fantasies, irrational impulses, and things like that, and the psychological dimension of the social processes. So let me just say that I think that considering that the Western imagination is very much rooted in the image of apocalypse and of violence, everything is possible, especially in the situation of such crisis which is before us, because we may only predict what's going to happen after lockdown and maybe after the second wave of the coronavirus. I think that we are right now we are facing maybe one of the most intense crises in the modern Western history.
As you said, it's always a matter of perspective. I remember coming back from quite some time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and it was 2014 when my friends in Warsaw here were asking me, can we expect war because of what was happening between Ukraine and Russia? And again, that was a question of perspective. I witnessed the real war in Afghanistan, and the possibility of war here in Europe seemed really distant thing. And Heather, please, your final remarks, maybe with circling around this rather gloomy question I asked around war.
Well, it's an important one because the four horses of the apocalypse never completely go away. And what we see now in the 21st century is a proliferation of new kinds of warfare. Disinformation is a form of warfare. And there's massive resources being put into it by, for example, Russia, which has also invested in its armed forces. Disinformation is perhaps the opposite of diplomatic negotiations. It's, jaw rather than war. It's a much cheaper way of trying to get what you want, capturing hearts and minds, and changing people's views and history's views of you than actually going to war itself. So I think it's very important to see that as a form of warfare. I'm myself quite cautious about using war metaphors for other things. For example, the fight against the pandemic. This is not a battle in a traditional way, and a militaristic metaphor doesn't necessarily help you. But it is very important to see the way that wars have started to look quite different. Think about the invasion of Crimea in 2014 with the little green men who didn't have uniforms, didn't have insignia, but they were still, nevertheless, that was about conquest of territory. So you can even these days have conquest of territory without the classic trappings of war, which means it's harder and harder to regulate and control it through things like the Geneva Convention. But we also have to think about other forms of warfare. The pandemic has brought up the idea of the use of armies against your own population. Look at Donald Trump threatening to send in the troops to enforce curfew. That's the kind of thing that usually leads to a civil war and immediately led to a massive backtracking by the US military, who saw the dangers to the military of being politicized in that way. And it's really vital to see that war is often about who controls the narrative. Most wars don't just happen overnight. They're usually preceded by a long period of the enemy being built up in the minds of a population in order to justify the war. Most leaders, whether they're authoritarian, democratic, whatever, like to have some justification for their war. And so they tend to demonize either a particular group, another country, something else, as being the enemy for quite a long time beforehand. So look at disinformation and who it is demonizing. So the control of the narratives around the pandemic, who was at fault, who has propagated it, these are also really important to defining the enemy, and that tells you something about the risks of going to war. So look at how fast China started reacting against, for example, the United States Pompeo in one of the negotiations at international level, trying to claim that it should be called the Wuhan virus, and insisting on that appearing in the minutes of a meeting. So the shaping of narrative is itself a form of warfare, because it's all about justifying who's the enemy and who's on side. But of course, wars also happen accidentally. They can happen also there's all this build-up, but nobody expected a particular moment to spark it off. And of course, we always think about 1914 and the assassination in Sarajevo. But I think there's another interesting fictional one that has also sometimes become a reality. Evelyn Waugh, the British novelist, wrote a novel in 1938 called Scoop, in which a journalist manages to start a war because he just happens to arrive in the wrong place. He's supposed to be covering a war. He arrives in the wrong country. And so he starts writing about a war that isn't happening, but he starts filing stories in London, sending them back by telegraph, saying, oh, I've just seen these soldiers doing this, and the front seems to be opening up there, just because he's trying to justify his expenses and the fact he's trying to cover up his mistake. And he ends up starting a real war because people start reacting to this as if the war is happening in the place where he is. And this was a satire in 1938, but actually it has happened at various points in history where an assumption that there was some kind of confrontation going on has then led people to react. So the psychological dimension of warfare is still very much there, both for a hot war as well as for the psychological wars like disinformation. So I think we should that's still a very important thing. And of course, climate change is going to bring more conflicts over resources. There's no question about that. Conflicts over water, access to water, over minerals, and other kinds of natural resources that are going to become scarcer, and over land as sea levels rise. So I think we should start thinking quite carefully about what prevents war beyond interdependence. The European Union was founded on the idea that countries that trade a great deal and have massive economic interdependence don't go to war against each other. And that's worked really well for 60 years between France and Germany. Will it continue to work when supply chains are shown to be so vulnerable and when everybody comes under pressure to maintain agricultural land, access to water of a kind we've never faced before? Will we, humanity, go back to the old ways of fighting physically over these things? Or can we go back to or can we move forward into ways of finding international agreements around them? Frankly, at the moment, the outlook is not very optimistic. It's less so than it was 20 years ago. So we need to start working on this before the crunch time happens.
Let's hope for the better scenario. Ivan, Heather, Tomasz, I wish we could do this in a real time, because I can imagine the big round of applause at the end of this meeting. Thank you for the very insightful comments, sometimes quite humorous and quite witty. Thank you for that. I would like to thank also the representation of European Commission in Warsaw for making this this online conference possible. And once again, I wish, I really desire that we meet face to face in a better times quite soon. Thank you very much. Stay safe, and once again, thank you very much.